Hey everyone, it looks like we have a growing audience. I see 223 people, and I'm sure it will continue to grow. But we're 2 minutes on the hour, and I want to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover, and we're hoping to field as many questions as we possibly can. So welcome to the webinar hosted in partnership between MIKRA and Innolitics. We're here today to talk about the recent updates to FDA guidance documents, both in final and draft form, that impact the cybersecurity and software landscape here in the US. So next slide. So before we dive into the topics today, I want to give a really quick overview of MIKRA for those of you who are not currently working or collaborating with us. But MIKRA is a global clinical research organization and integrated advisory firm. We have teams located in the US, Europe, and Japan. And we are here to be a full service partner to medical device manufacturers, navigating the variety of stakeholders you would engage with across the product development lifecycle. So not just developing and executing clinical trials and navigating your regulatory bodies, but importantly, reimbursement, health economics and market access, quality assurance, manufacturing, healthcare compliance, and obviously cybersecurity. With that, I'll pass it to you, John, to give a quick overview of Innolitics, and then we'll dive right in. Next slide.
Thanks a lot, Nikki. Hey, everybody. So my name is John, and I represent the CTO of Innolitics. So we've been, for the last 10 years, we've helped our clients ranging from startups to Siemens both make their SAMD in 6 months and also get their SAMD FDA submitted in 3 months. And we use our knowledge of both software engineering, machine learning, AI, regulatory to help you write more of your documentation for you and get it to the market as soon as possible. And if you need any help for both writing the software or also getting FDA cleared, please let us know. Thanks, Nikki.
Next slide. So I'm sure many of you are asking if you can have access to the slides or the recordings. Just want to make sure we go over a few logistics. So first, if you have any questions, please drop those in the Q&A function that you'll see in the top banner of the Teams meeting you're in. We will be monitoring that throughout the webinar and do our best to address as many as we possibly can. If we get to a point where we simply have run out of time, we will do our best to circle back with the folks who are registered and answer those offline. We will also be distributing the recording of this webinar and the slides to all of those who are registered to this event. So next slide. So just quickly give you a lay of the land of what you can expect over the next hour and a half. I'll do a very, very high level introduction of those who are going to be presenting and participating on our panel discussion later, though they will give a more detailed overview of their expertise and background when they start presenting. We'll jump in first to cybersecurity and quality management systems. We'll have a very, very short Q&A just to solidify understanding or clarify anything that may have come up through that presentation. Then we'll move to software development and documentation, do the same thing there. Then we'll open it up for our entire panel to have a discussion, and then we will tackle as many of the live Q&A questions you submit via the platform. Next slide. So this is a high-level overview of who will be speaking today. My name is Nikki Batista. I'm the Vice President of Digital Health Regulatory Affairs here at MIKRA, and I am joined by David and Yujan from Innolitics, and then my colleagues Alex, Lauren, and Dan from MIKRA. So with that, I will pass it to Lauren and Dan to kick us off with cybersecurity and quality management systems. Oh, you're muted, Lauren.
Right now.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Good morning. Thanks, Nikki. So obviously, thanks for joining this morning. My name is Lauren White, and I'm the Director of IT and Security here at MIKRA. I joined MIKRA almost 2 years ago now, coming up on November, as really to help support security. I joined the prior 5 years. I worked as a security engineer at one of the largest hospitals here in the DC, Baltimore area. And I really saw this position as an opportunity to bridge the gap between pre-market cybersecurity and post-market cybersecurity for medical devices. So as indicated here, the topic is really a two-part discussion, recognizing that the newest FDA guidance is titled Cybersecurity Medical Devices Quality System Considerations. So as such, I'll be delighted and am delighted to be joined today by my new partner in crime, albeit that partnership is largely mandated by the newest cybersecurity guidance, Dan Goldstein, whom you'll have an opportunity to meet here shortly. Next slide. So thinking about what cybersecurity looks like and how it's kind of evolving in this healthcare landscape. And as you can see here, year over year, in fact, for 12 years in a row, healthcare has led by industry in the number of security breaches reported. Now, what I think is also worth noting here is of those breaches reported by these healthcare companies, 88% of those who were surveyed reported that at least one connected device was a contributing factor. Now, take into additional consideration that over 50% of healthcare IoT devices have critical risks associated to them, and more than 40% of those are end of life, offering no security patches or updates. It's really no wonder that we're starting to see this shift in FDA's position as it relates to cybersecurity. So why does this matter? Well, because security matters. So two of the questions that I get asked probably most often is one, what do we need to be doing for security? And two, where do we start? Let's go to the next slide. So what do we need to be doing? So I think just to even kick off this conversation is I think we all need to be cognizant of really the maturing landscape that we're seeing in regulation around cybersecurity. So the things that I really wanted to highlight to kind of hone in on what we're seeing kind of regulation and law, really by law, are these two areas. So we have the omnibus bill, which included the RTA policy, the refuse to accept policy that was passed December of 2022, and then enacted March of 2023 that tells us that medical device manufacturers should have a maintenance plan that includes vulnerability management, and maintenance of the device security throughout its life cycle. But more importantly, it also tells us that as of March 29th, you are now required to have security documentation as part of your submission. So really gone are the days where you can submit to the agency without it. It's now becoming a critical aspect to your overall submission. Now, we also have the newest draft guidance that came out April of 2022, which looks to expand previous requirements to add in security to quality management systems, increase submission types with the inclusion of IDEs, while it also provides increased clarity and it removes risk tiers. So really the big question is, where do you start? Next slide, please. So where is your starting line? So oftentimes I tell folks that security should start at the front door. Now, what this means is understanding or establishing where you are as an organization, because when we understand security at the organizational level, we'll find that it feeds downstream into everything else that we do as a company. Now, your people really are your security. So when they're aware of security, they will build it into everything else around them. So really, this is where I impress upon folks to establish where you are as an organization in your security journey. Now, when we say that this feeds kind of downstream, software. So when we look at the omnibus bill, the refuse to accept policy, this new guidance, we're talking about really software and what does secure software development look like? And so we really need to be incorporating security into those efforts. Understanding the role that security by design plays in your ecosystem, understanding how you build security at the very beginning of your device development kind of lifespan, your journey, if you will, when you're building medical devices, is how are you building it into the design? selecting threat modeling and risk frameworks that work best for your organization. I always say that you should align those two with your organizational needs or goals that you have. Having a plan for how you're going to maintain device security post-market. Now, I think it's worth noting that FDA is really kind of your starting point. FDA is not the end goal, it's just kind of the start of your journey. So now not only do you have to think about, okay, what do I need to do to get through FDA, but also what does interoperability look like? How do I actually get my device into a healthcare system or a clinical environment in a secure way that works within that setting? So I think it's really important that you understand what that looks like and then document everything. I can't tell you how often I have folks come across my desk where they're like, oh, we do that, but we don't document anything. So it's really quite critical that you document everything that you're doing, because this is going to be something that you're going to want to come back to on a regular cadence. Next slide. Security should start very early in the device's life cycle. It's often quite costly to build security backwards into the device rather than building into the beginning. Now, what this means is, and I often tell folks, it's the ideation phase. So when you are thinking about creating a piece of software, your software is a medical device, software in a medical device, when you're at the big table and you're thinking about, okay, I have this big idea of how I want to actually do this or develop this, or this is what I want the outcome to look like from a patient consideration, you should also in that moment be thinking of, how do I build security into this? What are the things that I need to be thinking about as far as security concerns, play out for your development activities? And so I think sitting down and talking about that, and I'm not going to cover these in length, obviously, but I would encourage you all to think about how you're going to maintain your software. So how are you going to provide updates or patches when the occasion calls for it? Do you need to have device integrity or data protection or access controls? Who's going to be accessing that device or that piece of software? And do you need to have specific user profiles? So what does that role-based access control look like? How are you going to maintain availability or reliability of that device if it's compromised? So all of these things should be considered very early on. And so I think once you've done that, you begin your development activities, really you're already starting to think about how you're going to build security into the design, which leads me into kind of the next topic, which we'll talk about risk assessment and threat modeling. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about threat modeling and risk frameworks, what I've done here in this infographic on the screen is to present that there is no single way to accomplish these tasks. Now you'll notice that front and center we have STRIDE and ISO 14971. These are front and center because they are widely recognized and used often for these activities, but it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And in fact, in my experience, FDA just wants to know that you have a risk framework, that you have a threat modeling methodology. And so I think it's important to recognize that you don't have to pick STRIDE, you don't have to pick ISO 14971. There are a number of other things out there, other methodologies you can use, or they share overall goals in your documentation. Go to the next slide, please. So recognizing that I'm really spending a good bit of time here at a very high level, and I'll jokingly say that I'm genetically predisposed to talk far longer than the time limit I'm given. I want to spend really just 2 slides to cover the bus build did, and then things that you should be mindful of as you can kind of continue on your security journey. So first is how FDA is rethinking their approach to cybersecurity. Now, what I get really excited about between final guidances, and I say that recognizing that the current draft guidance is not yet finalized, but is expected to become final end of this fiscal year. Now, what the omnibus bill did is it required FDA to work with to work with CISA to update existing guidance on cybersecurity within 2 years and periodically thereafter, but also that at least yearly FDA must update its online resources to offer the most up-to-date information on how to spot and address vulnerabilities. So what this tells us is that FDA will be practicing what they seek to regulate. They now have to participate in their own narrative. Moreover, FDA is looking at how they can continue to shift left with their security guidance. They've moved into quality management systems, but really who's to say that's where it stops? I think we're going to see this continued maturity in this space, and that's really exciting, especially for folks like myself as the security practitioner, as we kind of embark on this journey with the agency. Next slide, please. And I see that my audio is cutting out for folks. I do apologize. I largely think that it happens when people join. So if you've missed anything that I've said and you want clarity or ask questions, please just drop it in the chat and we'll make sure that we get any of your questions answered. So I recognize that I also have other colleagues of mine who are here to talk about their respective topics. I will leave you with this kind of as a, something to chew on and think about as we move this forward. So remember that threat modeling will be key for 510Ks, de novos, PMAs, and IDEs. Now, while your security documentation is a single component to your overall submission, your threat modeling activities are really going to drive all subsequent security documentation. So you're going to start with your device architecture, you're going to threat model, you're going to risk assess, and then you're going to have maintenance and labeling, everything that kind of comes downstream from that. So I think it's important to recognize that threat modeling is going to be a fairly key component to that. Recognizing that FDA's goal is to really have medical device manufacturers have consistent and robust documentation, but note that it doesn't have to be complicated. Your security documentation should really scale with the risk level of the device. Thinking big picture, again, at the very beginning, I mentioned that we really want to be thinking of security holistically, organizationally speaking, because when you build security into your organization kind of culture, it will feed down into everything else that you're doing from a process and procedure perspective. So really how you handle your device security from development into maintenance and then end of life, we really need to be thinking about it big picture. Security labeling, there are new requirements that have come out from the new guidance around labeling, some of which that I have some concerns with just from an organizational standpoint. I have indicated as much to the agency directly. It's just to say, hey, some of the requests that you have for labeling around security could inherently put organizations at risk. And so I think we need to be very mindful of the information that's being presented in labeling documentation. So my guidance up to this point, or my suggestion, is to get creative and be aware of how you approach labeling for cybersecurity. You want to be informative, but not give too much away. So understanding your audience and the risks will be important. And then focusing on cloud, even when it's not in scope. So I think it's important to note that even if you indicate as part of your submission that cloud is out of scope, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be prepared to speak to any of the dependencies that your device may have on that cloud environment, and then recognizing and being able to speak to the security controls that you have in place. And then as a final thought is the PDCA, so Plan, Do, Check, Act. I really, really believe and often tell clients that your security documentation should be living, breathing, organic documentation. It's not a one and done sort of situation. It should be revisited at least annually, and then more often, obviously, when architecture or design changes are made. This is really because our threat landscape is constantly changing and evolving. I think it's quite critical that you revisit your security documentation often, so that you understand any changes that might be occurring kind of out in the wild. So I realize that I've gone through a lot of this at a very high level. Again, thank you all for your participation this morning. I do want to pass this over to Dan Goldstein, who will be talking with you this morning about quality management systems and the new guidance. So Dan, I'm going to pass it over to you. The floor is yours.
Lauren, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, everybody, wherever you happen to be. I'm Dan Goldstein. I'm Senior Director for Quality Assurance here at MIKRA. I've been in medical device quality assurance since 2002. I've been with MIKRA since 2016. I'm only mentioning 2002 because the very first medical device I worked on was a software device. It was actually created as software in a medical device. And Dr. Alex Kadat, who's on this call, actually has some familiarity with the device and the company. It was quickly developed into a software as a medical device, a software-only device. But in 2002, FDA didn't actually know how to digest that. And so it was still marketed within hardware because it had to be. FDA has made great strides in the area since then. It's been a few years, since 2002, but I have to say, just in the past few years, the number of advances in terms of how FDA views software and cybersecurity, and now specifically within the quality system, which wasn't the case previously, is a huge stride forward. And just as a side note, I apologize, the upper right part of the screen here where it says draft guidance, I want you to know that at 11 o'clock this morning EDT, that was correct. And at 11:03, several of us got an email announcing that as of September 27th, tomorrow, the guidance is a final guidance. But we're going to be speaking about what we have in hand right now, which is pretty much the same as what's going to be going out finally. So what is FDA doing here? FDA is kind of abruptly applying cybersecurity across the entire quality system. Anyone who's worked with ISO 13485 is familiar with the concept of risk management being applied across an entire quality management system. FDA, up until now, has not done that explicitly. We'll be discussing that in a few slides, but up until now, FDA has only applied risk officially in the regulations fairly narrowly in the area of design control, whereas risk is applied by 1345 across the quality system. Well, now FDA is applying cybersecurity itself across the whole quality system. The change in the title from the previous final guidance and draft guidance isn't just nomenclature. This is not just, a semantic thing. The previous title really was content of pre-market submissions for management of cybersecurity and medical devices. And the point was, if you're making a submission to FDA, look at all these things, focus on all these things. These are activities you have to carry out. And this is the kind of stuff that Lauren and the entire regulatory team has been always working on with medical device manufacturers. And frankly, from a quality assurance perspective, we kind of got a pass. In other words, we know that the quality system gets inspected by FDA, certainly for any device that's on the market, at least in theory, you can be inspected. For a 510K device, which is most of them, you don't expect to be inspected by FDA until after the device is on market. For a PMA device, you would have your quality system checked at least twice, once when they look at the PMA submission itself, and then once for the pre-approval inspection. But all this to say, FDA would be inspecting the quality system according to the relevant regulations and guidances, which really did not include looking at your quality system for cybersecurity overall. They would look at risk management activities, certainly within design controls, and they might ask you, have you covered cybersecurity in your risk management documentation? And certainly you have, but it was never a focus. By changing the title, and frankly, by changing the content of the draft guidance, now finalizing, FDA is requiring the application of cybersecurity across, again, the entire quality system. So this guidance, as of last year, and today now finalized, requires specifically cybersecurity applied to complaint handling procedures, quality audits, CAPAs, risk analysis, servicing of devices that are already on market in customers' hands, all the things you see here, and then the great line, including but not limited to. So what this means now is that this becoming a final guidance, this becoming something that FDA can and will apply during reviews of quality systems for PMA devices and inspections of quality systems for all of us, FDA absolutely can walk in and say, I don't see where you've applied cybersecurity in your complaint handling process. And if you have a device that's subject to the guidance, you're going to be subject to that. Next slide, please. So I want to point out here's part of the concern from my perspective of applying draft guidances too early. And again, now the final guidance is coming out, this is a whole new world. FDA will come out with a draft guidance and then sometimes yet another draft guidance, as in the case of cybersecurity. Remember, there was a 2018 draft guidance, which was never finalized. And now the 2022 draft guidance apparently has been finalized as is. But if you change your quality system to reflect what a draft guidance says is on the way, which is not in any way enforced by FDA, you may be making unnecessary changes, burdensome changes that you then have to reverse. And I'm going to give you 3 examples right here from this specific area. The previous draft guidance did not require something called a Secure Project Development Framework, the SPDF. Now we have that. I'm not going to get into the details of it in the course of this brief slide, but the point is this is a structure that's, because of the way it's dictated in the draft guidance, you are now going to be expected to have your quality system itself address how do we build the SPDF. It's not simply a design control process. It's not simply a thing that you present with your 510K submission to FDA. This is going to be an ongoing quality system responsibility, the SPDF. If you had built your quality system changes based on the previous draft guidance, you wouldn't have included that. Now, on the flip side, here's 2 things that were taken out. There were risk tiers, and risk tiers mattered, again, in the previous draft guidance. In the previous draft guidance, you had to basically assign one of 2 risk tiers, higher and standard cybersecurity risks, and that was understood to be part of your assessment of the system, which again would be dictated by the quality system, and they took that out. So why would you put it in the quality system to begin with? And my final example here, the CBOM, the Cybersecurity Bill of Materials. Now, a software bill of materials is this internationally recognized concept that all companies really on an international level with medical devices with software have to address the software bill of materials. FDA had included this concept of a separate cybersecurity bill of materials, which was not that happily received in the industry in general, and they've stepped back from that. So again, here's why I'm saying these things should be applied only when guidance has become finalized, because a draft guidance may include requirements that don't end up making it into the final guidance. Just briefly about timing, Lauren and I often talk about how there's cybersecurity considerations early on for the device, and then later on for the quality system, and really try and stick with that concept. Next slide, please. So finally, I just want to briefly talk about some documents that have come out, and I did mention the past few years have been very busy. The first one, which I mentioned a couple of slides ago, has to do with this proposed final rule. So many of you are aware, FDA has taken a huge leap forward now. The quality system regulation, which has been in place more or less as is since 1997, is being replaced. This is an enormous change. The proposed final rule came out in early 2022. FDA is probably going to be finalizing this within the next few months, very soon. And what this is going to do is, for the first time, take the entire quality system regulation and replace it. Not just revise it, slightly replace it. ISO 13485 is going to be more or less applied to all US distributed devices, plus a few add-ons and changes from FDA specific to definitions, record keeping for quality records, certain things that you have to do beyond 1345 from FDA's perspective. But basically, the entire regulation is being replaced. And again, I mentioned ISO 13485 is very heavily risk-oriented. So will the QMSR, the Quality Management System Regulation, be heavily risk-oriented. The proposed final rule doesn't mention cybersecurity, which we now see as a pretty heavy element of risk. The draft guidance, which for computer software assurance, which is essentially replacing the old guidances for how you control the software, not in your device, but the software that your quality system and your production rely upon. That new draft guidance talks about risk extensively, doesn't mention cybersecurity. You would think that cybersecurity would be a big factor in that kind of guidance. Another thing I wanted to mention was the final guidance for the content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. This will be discussed by others in more detail than by me, but the point is, here is guidance that describes in detail the types of documentation that you not only have to submit to FDA, but also maintain within your design history file. It does mention cybersecurity, mostly in pointing to other guidance documents, including this brand new guidance that we're looking at right here. And finally, off-the-shelf software use in medical devices. Brand new final guidance from last month. Off-the-shelf software, in other words, somebody else's software that you incorporate into your own device software, that is inherently higher risk than the software you develop yourself because you control it less. This final guidance mentions cybersecurity just briefly. So again, if you look at all these new documents that are coming online, all these new requirements, they are interrelated, but you have to look at them together and you have to keep them all in mind, especially this new guidance for cybersecurity. It's going to dictate so much of risk-associated activities that the other guidances require without bringing cybersecurity into it. Next slide, please. So any questions for us?
So Dan, I do want to ask you a quick question, and I think you may have kind of skimmed over the topic earlier. So, you heard me preaching earlier that medical device security specifically really needs to start very, very, very early in the process of development, right? We say that it should really start at the front door. So when would you expect quality management systems to incorporate cybersecurity, right? Because I don't think you're going to approach it the same way that you're actually building security into the device. So when would you say that they need to start considering that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I should have guessed that Lauren would be the first one to ask questions before anybody else did, because we do this interplay all the time. The timing thing is crucial. When we build quality management systems, we're always thinking of the timing of regulatory submissions and the timing of pre-submission activities. Lauren's right. You can never start working on cybersecurity too early when you're thinking about the device. This is an early stage activity. And yet from the quality systems perspective, especially for a company that's not yet on market, for a startup company, if it's your very first device, you get a fair amount of leeway in terms of your design history file development, your risk management file development. It is not unusual for a 510K to be submitted for a device where the DHF has just very recently been completed based retrospectively on work that was being done months and months ago. That's perfectly reasonable for a device that's not yet on market. Once you're on market, you have to carry out design change activities, obviously, properly according to your quality system. But there's a sense of, for a new company with a new device, you can start too early with the formalized design control activities, which incorporate risk management, which incorporate cybersecurity considerations. So again, what we recommend is building your quality management system with the appropriate timing, with the appropriate staging, bearing in mind that your device work, Lauren's cybersecurity work, might be starting long before then. And once you build that quality management system, now, according to this brand new guidance, you will have to incorporate cybersecurity at that point into all of your quality activities, really all of them.
So I know we're getting a slew of questions through the chat, and I will do my best to articulate as many as I can in this little bit right here. But building off of that question, Lauren, I think there's some questions about how to actually operationalize this concept of a secure product development framework or secure software development. Maybe you could speak to what that could look like and maybe reemphasize the idea that there are checkpoints throughout the entire product lifecycle rather than what we have historically seen as cybersecurity as a Band-Aid solution at the end after the product's been designed.
Yeah, and I think, and thank you for the folks who informed me that FDA got sneaky and put out final guidance this morning, largely while I was probably getting coffee. And I think, I saw the question earlier about this kind of this framework that is outlined in the guidance, and it was part of the draft guidance and now subsequently part of the final guidance. It's this concept of secure product development framework. And the reality is that there is no one way or no right way to do these things. There are a ton of different frameworks and processes out there that you can follow, but really what they're trying to say is that we really need to be thinking about security holistically, right? I think a lot of the times when I came into this role at MIKRA, it was this, well, I can't tell you how many times I've kind of chuckled when a company has come to me and said, well, security is not my job. Like, why should I have to be thinking about this? I just want to get it, in front of FDA and I want to get it out to the market. But then you've had companies who get through, they get through their review process and they get into a clinical setting and they realize that hospitals aren't willing to adopt that technology because it's not secure, or it's built with security as a kind of a backwards approach. And I think what FDA is doing here is they're saying, whatever frameworks you choose to use, threat modeling methodologies, risk frameworks, you could use NIST, you could use ISO, there's a ton out there. And really what they're saying is that frameworks exist to ensure that you have good security hygiene throughout the entire life cycle of the device. So they're saying, start it early, do it often, carry it throughout the life cycle of the device. So I don't think that there is one right answer to how do we do this. It's about finding process, procedure, methodologies, frameworks that work for you, and then making sure that you implement them and that you're actually following them. It can't just be this tiny subset of security, like, okay, as an organization, I'm only going to worry about security in this device. It's saying, think big, right? Think high level. How am I doing it organizationally? How am I creating awareness and education? And then what are the frameworks that I'm going to be using to implement that into my overall device development? So I think it's important to recognize that it's 2023 word of the year, holistic, right? It's a holistic approach to how you are handling cybersecurity.
There was a question about explaining exactly what an SBOM is and how would you recommend companies communicate an SBOM to their end user?
So this is a topic of conversation that I've actually had at the agency. So your SBOM, and I'm going to obviously lean on some of my digital health team members to help kind of relay this, because an SBOM for me is basically all of the different software components that you are using as part of your development activities. So it's libraries, it's operating systems, it's everything that kind of exists in this development ecosystem. And it captures all of that information, and then it gives you an idea of kind of what your landscape is. Now, one of the things, and this is why I say getting creative with labeling, is part of the labeling requirements for cybersecurity is that you put your SBOM in your labeling documentation, which I am super against. And I've actually told FDA, like, think of the general lay user. My mom, I use my mom as a good reference point. She's not going to know what that is. She's not going to know what to do with that. But I can tell you that a threat actor would. And so I think it's really critical that we recognize that there's some information you don't want to be presenting to general users, right? I think even clinical users, I would express caution around that. And so one of the things that was recommended is that you not put it in your labeling documentation, but that you create an avenue in which to have a request made to get the SBOM. So when I met with policy writers at FDA, it was, oh, well, in our ideal world, we would have a portal, right? So you as a company would have a portal where your buyers or device users could log in and request the SBOM and pull it down whenever they wanted it. But they have also said, okay, hey, you can just send us an email. Like, as long as these folks have an opportunity to request an SBOM and to get an SBOM, that has been sufficient up to this point. So I think all of that to say, it's important to recognize kind of the ask and get creative in how you choose to present that material.
And so one last question. I know we have a slew of others that we'll try our best to answer towards the end of this webinar, but there's an interesting question that we also faced all the time, and it's if a software as medical device is on a cloud platform and it's SOC 2 certified, the cloud that is, how far, well, I guess the question is, what would the company have to do to meet FDA's requirements? So really, I think the question is, what aspects of a SOC 2 certified cloud platform would you have to include in your FDA facing documentation?
So I think that's a really good question. And I can tell you from experience up to this point, you can tell me you're SOC 2, and that doesn't inherently mean anything. And I also say that from working as a security engineer in the hospital, where often we would have companies come in and say, oh, well, we're SOC 2 certified. Well, okay, well, can you tell us about the controls that you have in place? And so oftentimes we would ask for attestation letters, something that from a high level says, hey, we're following industry best practice, like this is what it looks like. And really what what FDA is looking for, and something that I advise on, is if you can give, instead of just saying I'm SOC 2, saying here are some of the baseline controls that I have in place. Because what FDA wants to see is what you're doing. They don't want this high level, hey, well, I'm SOC 2, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, because they want to see what sort of security controls you have. So I think if you can just address them at a high level and be able to speak to them, oftentimes, the question becomes, well, we just have the cloud. Like, we don't know what security controls we have. And I would implore you to go back to your cloud provider and create a relationship with them, so that you do have this back and forth where you can speak intelligently to your environment and not just depend on whatever they put out of the box. I think you need to engage and make sure that you understand what your controls are, because FDA will want to know what your controls are.
Awesome. I want to keep the party moving, and so we'll move to the next slide and pass it off to Alex and David to walk us through software development and documentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Cadat. I'm the Senior Director for Imaging and Digital Health at MIKRA. I've been here for about 2.5 years, formerly with the FDA for 6, working with digital health. Had minor contributions to some of these guidances and hopefully going to give you a good run through from how this looks from our perspective. I'm joined by David. If you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, I'm David Giese. Sometimes you'll see John in front of my name because I usually go by David. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Innolitics along with you, John. And my background's in biomedical engineering. I then worked as a software engineer for 12 years before moving into regulatory.
So some of the questions that this section of the presentation will cover is, what are the changes from the new guidance? Hopefully, FDA is not going to drop a brand new software guidance on us today, but it is a pretty recent update that has been in the planning stages for quite a long time. We're also going to discuss how this might impact you and briefly touch on some real-world examples. Next slide.
Great. So when you start reviewing the new guidance, one of the first things you'll notice is that the old level of concern has been replaced by what they're calling the documentation level. Unlike the level of concern, which had 3 levels, the documentation level has just 2, basic and enhanced. In many regards, they're similar. The documentation level is still determined by the pre-mitigation risk profile of the device. Anyway, Alex, what would you say is a practical rule of thumb for converting between the old level of concern for companies with existing devices and existing documentation to the new documentation level?
So often in 510K summaries, you'll likely find where the level of concern was documented for older devices. Generally speaking, minor and moderate are going to pretty much map to basic, and major is going to map to enhanced. And there is some gray area there because FDA left room for basically the risk of your device kind of informing what the documentation level is. But generally speaking, you should be able to use that precedence that you see with some exceptions, but generally to be able to inform what the new documentation level would be. One thing that also changed, which FDA sees as a simplification, is that for the basic documentation level, you're no longer required to submit a software design specification. However, one of the things that FDA did do with this guidance is make clear some of their expectation about what's going on behind the scenes. So that still means that you should be thoroughly documenting your software design specification and associated verification in your design history file. So, David, could you talk a little bit about where the line is between what you would include with a basic level submission? And, a question that we're often asked is, how detailed should my requirements be?
That's a great question. And a common struggle that we see with our clients when we're helping them with their software documentation is deciding how much detail is enough. Because as I'm sure many of you know, like you can always add more, and finding the right balance is kind of an art. So with respect to requirements, what we generally suggest is focus on requirements that trace back to risk management. Those tend to be very important requirements. Also focus on requirements that trace very directly back to the intended use. And then maybe and also cybersecurity is another big area, of course, as well. So requirements related to cybersecurity risk analysis, but maybe focus less on more tangential requirements around non-essential functionality and go into less detail there. So another big change another change in the software guidance is they provide a variety of more specific details on what they want to include in the software description document. In the 2005 guidance, there was really just a short paragraph. But now they've gone through, and I think there's maybe 2 or 2.5 pages of like, we want to see this and this, including a whole section on questions for AI and machine learning enabled devices. I think probably a lot of this is more or less obvious things that would be included, but if you have existing documentation, you may want to kind of go look through the new questions and make sure you're hitting on all those points. So Alex, yeah, how would you say manufacturers should adjust to these new details?
So a lot of the new details that appear in the guidance is basically FDA being a little bit more clear of what their expectations are. One of the main things that FDA uses your software description along with other materials from your submission is basically a comparative review. So basically comparing what you have in one section of your documentation to the other. So, for a software as a medical device, that can be pretty straightforward because you're basically providing a description of your device kind of again, but getting into a little bit more details about how you implemented your software in general. And that kind of also includes some of the details for AI machine learning, which, FDA does have a lot of expectations that you're describing AI machine learning best practices and other basic information that helps FDA understand any inherent biases that might be included in your device. And also generally just to compare that to the intended use that you're proposing for your device. Through that comparative review, FDA is basically looking to see if they all match up. Kind of speaking of that kind of comparative review, one of the other areas that FDA has emphasized is the system and software architecture. FDA is, again, being a little bit more specific about what they expect to see. A lot of times there's a balance between too much, where you're providing more detail, and kind of the opposite end of the spectrum where you're not providing enough. So another thing that is important from your architecture is if there is off-the-shelf software being included in other functions, how do they kind of factor into the architecture of your system? FDA, again, wants to understand that from a comparative review perspective. Probably one of the biggest comparisons FDA is doing with the system and software architecture is basically comparing that to your threat model. So, one very easy thing to understand is that if your threat model doesn't include items that are on your architecture diagrams, I think that FDA is going to be likely to ask questions, and vice versa if there's things in your architecture that aren't included in your threat model. So you definitely want to make sure that for these different points of comparison, that you are providing enough information for FDA to understand how you're being consistent across your design. And FDA also suggests multiple views depending on the complexity and depth of your software where necessary. So David, what common mistakes have you seen with architectural diagrams?
Sure, yeah. So like you alluded to in earlier, another common mistake is going into too much detail, especially when you have the software engineers who are often drawing these diagrams, going into too much detail about the internals. And what we suggest is focus more on the very systems you integrate with. If your device has multiple components like an iPad app and servers, make sure you hit all of those and go into usually a little less detail than people tend to do, or engineers tend to do, on the internals. Maybe relegate some of those specifics into the software design specification. Another thing to keep in mind is the difference between static and dynamic architectural views. And sometimes there can be kind of a mix, but having clarity on what the semantic meaning of the blocks and arrows in your diagrams are is another common mistake that we see. So in addition to these first four items we mentioned, there's a few other changes in the draft, or not in the guidance that we'd mentioned. So a few of the documents have been renamed. The device hazard analysis has been replaced with the full risk management file, whereas previously you focused it was kind of a subset focused on just software. Now you're just turning in the whole thing. Finally, you can use a declaration of conformity to IEC 62304 in place of some software lifecycle documents that you'd have to include otherwise. Oh, and I'd also mention the new off-the-shelf software guidance that just came out recently also ties into the overall documentation level, whereas previously you could kind of evaluate each off-the-shelf software item independently, and there was an independent level. So especially for devices with enhanced documentation level that might increase how much documentation you need for off-the-shelf software. So next slide, please.
So the next topic that we'll discuss here is kind of FDA software documentation versus the design history file, because, you know, even still with this guidance, FDA isn't asking for your entire design history file. They're basically asking for what we often like to call the top layer. So one of the things with our focus on software as a medical device, when it comes to the software design specification, you know, FDA does make it clear here with this particular quote from the guidance that for the basic level of concern, that while you're not required to provide that to FDA, that it basically means that you still should be documenting that as part of your design history file, so that if FDA does find a particular function or a concern that they need to have more depth of information on, that you have that information ready to provide should FDA have specific questions that would require that information. Additionally, FDA has also pointed to how prospective documentation as a best practice. Often it's pretty easy to tell with different companies when they've kind of done a retrospective documentation of their software as opposed to doing it while they're developing the software. But you know, and a lot of FDA reviewers kind of understand what that looks like. Generally speaking, that kind of results in kind of a lower level of detail, less traceability, and basically just having just enough documentation to kind of cover things. And oftentimes where FDA sees problems with that is that things like your hazard analysis don't necessarily trace very well to the rest of your documentation. So in some ways it can be kind of easy to find, but also, you know, let's face it, you know, it may be a best practice, but it may not always be possible. So David, with the next slide, could you give us a little bit more detail on how Innolitics can help with that?
Absolutely, yeah. As you said, certainly the best approach is to develop your design history as you go and not retrospectively document it. But it is a common problem where companies, either because they've developed software and then maybe they added some new functionality or changed the intended use and which pushes it into becoming a device, or they just have a team that's new to the medical device industry, which is increasingly common with the AI machine learning boom. They just don't have experience with this, and they kind of rush to get that prototype, and the development gets further along before they really start thinking about documentation. So when you do find yourself in this situation, you really have two main options. One is to have your engineers write all of the documentation, usually, of course, with guidance from a regulatory group who has some experience. But I would say this can be a long process. In our experience, we'll see 9 to 15 months, and not being uncommon, and it can turn into the rate limiting step for the submission. Not only that, you know, engineers generally don't love documenting things, and that you often will have other things you'd rather have your engineers working on. So a second approach is if you have a team who has software experience and regulatory experience who can really get into the weeds and understand your device, they can come draft a lot of the documents and really kickstart the process for your team, which can save really a lot of time. Because then not only are they teaching your team how to follow the process, what it means to document medical device software, but they're also giving them concrete examples they can work off of. So next slide, please. And yeah, and so this, I would say this is one of the services that we offer at Innolitics, is if you're in this situation, helping teams kind of navigate the process of documenting all of this and going straight to the 510K as fast as possible. One thing I would point out that's dangerous is what we often, once we start documenting and doing risk analysis and all these other things, usually there are software changes that need to happen. And companies often won't want to face that, like, hey, there were gaps and that will require more work. So I would say it doesn't really alleviate the overall amount of work by using this approach, but it does streamline things quite a bit. So Next slide, please.
So I'd like to open it up for questions.
Hey, I'm back. So we have a question that just came in regarding the OTS guidance. So in a hypothetical situation, you have some off-the-shelf software you're incorporating into your system. You've determined that your system is an enhanced level of documentation. And the question is, how in depth would you expect to go as it relates to understanding the off-the-shelf software developers' design and development methodologies? Given that this is likely proprietary, it might be difficult to even attain. What are your thoughts on meeting that recommendation in the guidance?
Well, I think everything with OTS kind of traces back to risk. When you're using something off the shelf, you're assuming responsibility for the risks without necessarily having control over the software. So for something that's at a major level of concern, basically you're already kind of in a place where you've determined that the device has a specific and higher risk, generally speaking, than other devices. So you need to go through your off-the-shelf software and basically make sure that if there's any residual risks related to using that software as part of your implementation, that you've properly mitigated for it. It's just simply not acceptable for you to say, well, this is someone else's responsibility. FDA, through this guidance, makes it very clear that it's your responsibility to mitigate those risks. So I would say that a lot of those risks related to that, and if you do need to kind of go into those specific softwares to examine those risks, I think it would kind of fall out of your kind of risk management process and the risk that you've identified for that software. David, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Sure. I would just add that especially if this is regarding an enhanced documentation level device where there could be serious injury or death, you may want to consider that some of the off-the-shelf software you have in your that you've incorporated should be removed. And this is an exercise we often suggest, like really pare it down as much as you can when you're dealing with that level of risks. I could talk more about dealing with open source software that's kind of developed out in the open and things like that, but I'll stop there. So
I do have a follow-up question to a point that you made earlier about dedicating staff to support software documentation. There's obviously a burden amongst industry to do that, and it takes time and effort and resources. But I'm curious, what can developers be doing while they're designing software that could potentially ease the burden of developing that software documentation later on? Most importantly, I think a lot of companies are trying to maintain a certain pace, and software documentation is seen as a bottleneck or a pace limiter. So is there anything that you recommend to developers to do as they design? Maybe David, you could start.
Certainly, I think having the right tooling in place and getting your team trained up to make it as easy as possible to create the documentation as you go really helps. So there's a few ways to do this. You can use, for example, if you're using GitHub to do your pull requests, there's ways you can set up templates for generating certain types of records you need. There's ways to track certain things alongside the code, especially for the SDS, and generating some documents from the code. I'd also say there's certain documents that are easier, more important to do early on, especially risk management planning and doing the risk assessment and the security risk assessment. But doing those earlier in the process is really important, because if you identify problems that affect the architecture of the software, you really want to detect that early, because what you don't want is to get to the end and then realize there's fundamental issues with the architecture you've chosen, that you could have chosen a different architecture if you thought about it earlier, but now you're halfway through the process. So if you're gonna really go in depth early, I'd focus on the risk side. So
I have a quick question, if you don't mind. So I think you mentioned in one of your slides that it takes software teams that haven't done this before, it takes them about 9 months, or like 9 to 12 months, I think. what was the expectation? Like, how long did the team think it would take them when they started? And it ended up taking them 9 months. And kind of what was the differential there? Like, what ended up taking them longer than they originally thought?
Well, I think probably the thing that we've observed the most is kind of rate limiting steps to getting that 510(k) into FDA are kind of the two major topics we've been discussing today, especially if they come into the submission without having a good understanding of how FDA is going to view their software documentation. So doing the process that you guys talked about there, when it takes 9 months and you want to get your 510(k) in 4, I mean, obviously that becomes your rate limiting step. And the same is true with cybersecurity, where we've emphasized you need to get started with this pretty early, because we have seen that also be kind of a rate limiting step for what ends up going into the agency, that if you've not fully addressed all of those concerns and have that integrated throughout your submission, it can be a red flag for FDA that you're just basically not doing things in a way that promotes safety and effectiveness of your device.
Awesome. So next slide, I think we'll open it up and bring Lauren and Dan back. And I know I appreciate how vocal and active the participants have been. So I'm going to do my best to run through all of these questions. But I first do want to ask just kind of a couple of clarifying questions. I think one that just came through was, and I think this is largely due to FDA kind of terminology. I think in some instances they're moving towards harmonizing with industry. Sometimes they create their own terms. One person asked, what's the difference between OTS and SOUP? Does anyone want to take that?
Sure, I can take a stab at this one. So SOUP, or software of unknown provenance, could be developed by your company. So let's say you do develop certain software not following any process. You could consider that SOUP. Whereas off-the-shelf software, that designation refers to you're either purchasing it or grabbing open source software to incorporate in your device. So in practice, the two terms almost always overlap, but there are a few side cases where you can have off-the-shelf software that is, you do know the provenance of it, or you can also have SOUP that is not off-the-shelf software, if that makes sense. So.
I'm going to add the next question. So the FDA seems hesitant to allow a company to split the software modules into classes like that which 62304, the standard IEC 62304 allows. What are best practices when combining components of software? For example, an algorithm that produces an output meant to be interpreted versus the portal, which may be non-medical function. I can start. I think that we've always advised clients to architect their software in a modular format that gives them the flexibility on FDA oversight. So if you do have functionality within your software system that is not subject to FDA oversight, segregating that from software functionality that is allows for a cleaner segregation and software documentation. But I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
Well, there's certainly times when some of these portals, and it ends up being kind of a case by case basis, where the portal may be just simply what I like to call moving data around. So it might be simply a medical device data system that or MDDS is the term that's quite often used, that it kind of supports the moving of the outputs around and simply displaying this information. And so it often comes down to a question of, well, how important is this particular software to the intended use of your device? That often determines whether it even gets included in the regulatory submission as kind of part of the device. But I think one of the more important things here is that, back to our comments earlier about architecture and cybersecurity, FDA is still going to expect to see those things included in your threat model, included in your software architecture, kind of sitting on the periphery, so that it's clear that you've evaluated kind of the full footprint of your device.
Next question, can you speak to the overlap between IEC 62304 process requirements by risk level and the FDA guidance on documentation to be submitted in a pre-market submission? Maybe Alex or David, you want to take that?
Yeah. I'm trying to think through my head going through the 62304 section. So, I think so in 62304, right? They have the SDS and then they have the detailed design specifications. And so now at the basic level, the FDA is not even requiring the SDS. I mean, you need to do it, but you don't need to submit it. So, yeah.
Well, one thing I'll maybe add to things here, David, is FDA is kind of flirting a little bit more with 62304, but they've not necessarily gotten to the point where it's like a full match. Historically, there were situations where, if you deployed your device in the EU first and essentially came to the US, it may not be a perfect match. And that's still often true, that if you're coming to the United States, while FDA may not ask you to provide your design specification, if you ended up documenting for CE mark in a way that didn't include that level of detail, you may still be required to add that to your design history file in a way that complies more with what FDA is looking for. So I feel like FDA has kind of come closer to IEC 62304, but it's not a complete match at this point.
And I'd also point out that 62304 produces a number of records that are important for the design history file. And so it's very process oriented, whereas this guidance, the software guidance, is really focused on the end output. So it's not exact, it's kind of like a different compare. It's like, here's what you need to the minimum set of documents you need for us to evaluate the pre-market submission, where 62304 is more on the process.
Dan, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I only wanted to add, this is sort of where we cross the line between the review question and the inspectional question. In other words, everything that the FDA reviewers said, oh, I don't need to see that, I don't need to see that, I don't need to see that. The FDA investigator, when they come to inspect on-site in person, they can ask for all of it. And depending on the device, and to some extent, depending on the investigator, they may well ask for all of the details that you see, in the guidance is saying the design history file requires this. You should assume it's all mandatory. You should assume that missing something altogether without documenting why you don't need it will be grounds for an observation during an inspection. So absolutely, the full set of documentation should be maintained in-house. And when I say maintained, I also mean updated, especially when you think about design changes that are not submitted to FDA as a new 510K, which is most design changes typically. So always bear that in mind to keep those documents up to date.
Lauren, I want to ask you a question. I think someone's posed an interesting question about legacy devices. I think it'd be interesting to hear about your experience on the hospital network side, but how should we be viewing legacy devices, especially in light of hardware limitations where a lot of companies might not be able to actually meet the requirements that FDA has set forth today? What is some advice you could give to them?
Well, I mean, I think, so here's the thing with legacy devices, and obviously I'll lean on my regulatory folks here because I'm still kind of navigating what the expectation is as you update that device. And really when I think about legacy devices, I think about devices that don't have the capacity to be updated, right? When I worked at the hospital, that was our primary responsibility, was getting creative in how we were securing those devices who were considered legacy, right? That they were running on operating systems that were no longer receiving patches or updates. And so we had to find different ways, whether that was segmenting them onto their own clinical VLANs, making sure that they didn't have access to the internet because it was a fairly significant risk, but also having a process in place to say, okay, hey, we're going to have to get these systems out of our ecosystem. And we want to have a working relationship with device manufacturers so that we bring in the newest, latest, greatest, because we have, I mean, that's our landscape right now. We've got legacy devices that don't have to follow FDA guidance or didn't have to follow FDA guidance. And so security was never a consideration, right? And so I think it's good to see that there is a shift happening, but the reality is that these legacy devices are still out in the wild. I think it's nearly impossible, like I said during my bit of presentation earlier, trying to build security back into those devices is impossible. So you have to identify compensating controls, right? So how are you actually going to navigate that clinical environment to get it in there? So it's largely dependent on that clinical setting and the security engineers responsible for it. And then I think obviously following the new guidance going forward to make sure that future devices are following industry best practice around cybersecurity.
So really, for folks with legacy devices, it's about communicating compensating controls and working with your clinical partners to control risk to as acceptable of a level as possible. Or if you're in a situation where you do need to remove product from the field, that's something that you as the manufacturer have to decide.
Yeah.
A follow-up to threat modeling. So I think there's some questions around where do you set the boundaries of your threat model when your product is cloud hosted?
Well, I mean, that's a trick question because I would say you don't set boundaries. Like, I look at security very broadly speaking, right? So I'm not of the opinion that you should be setting boundaries. I think you need to understand your architecture, both from a device and a cloud perspective. You need to understand that threat landscape, all of your entry points, all of your exit points. I think all of it should be considered. Now, I say that, Nikki, and I still don't truly grasp when cloud needs to be included in scope and when it doesn't, right? So usually my job is just to talk about security. And so recognizing that what we've seen so far is if you say you have a cloud, even if it's not in scope, you still need to be cognizant of what that landscape looks like and what are the downstream, like, patient impacting sort of scenarios that you could face, right? If your cloud environment was compromised. So if it is compromised, even though it's not directly patient facing, is there any sort of patient impact from a clinical perspective or otherwise that you need to be cognizant of? And then you need to be able to speak to that. So I think just to summarize, I would not limit your threat modeling activities or your risk assessment activities, even if you think it's out of scope. How does it interplay, right? What does that look like? And then make sure that you address the whole thing.
A question on how to handle unresolved software anomalies. So FDA's guidance, this question says, quote, recommends considering the utilization of a defect classification system or taxonomy for each anomaly, such as, and they reference ANSI AMI SW91. Does this mean that FDA requires this usage of the standard, or would they accept a list of unresolved anomalies without that? Can you name any alternatives to SW91 that FDA would accept? Maybe you, John or David, you can speak to that.
Yeah, we haven't actually used that standard in any of the submissions we've done, and we've never had the FDA ask about it. Although that said, trying to think of, yeah, and that includes a couple since the new guidance. So that were cleared since the new guidance. So yeah, I'm not sure how important that using that exact taxonomy is. I can't honestly say I know for sure, but yeah.
Alex, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if you kind of consider the language FDA used there, and this is just kind of strictly speaking from an FDA speak perspective, they're making a suggestion, basically, if you're able to provide the same information that would apply to your device, and basically you're meeting the other kind of requirements that FDA puts forward for unresolved anomalies, I don't think that you're going to get a deficiency just for not using a specific method. However, if the method that you choose to use doesn't necessarily cover all the information that FDA wants to see, you might hear something back.
Yeah, I think the key component is those are voluntary consensus standards. So it's all choice to conform. Oh, Dan, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add anything?
No, to a separate question, actually.
Oh, okay. I did want to ask, there's a question about risk assessments. Let me find it. Do you think it's wise to combine cybersecurity risk documentation with traditional physical risk documentation? For example, think about when a cybersecurity risk could result in a traditional harm, a hacked insulin pump causing overdosages. So maybe Dan and Lauren, you could speak to how to incorporate cybersecurity risk management into the overall risk management of a device.
Right. So I'll start with my sort of simple view, and then I'll let Lauren get more into the cybersecurity specificity. So it's actually not even a question whether or not it's wise. It is mandatory. In other words, if we take off our cybersecurity hats for a moment, we put on our risk management hats, we can say, well, 14971 is very clear about that. We're obviously identifying all of the hazards, right, associated with, in this case, the design of the device. And in fact, the new 24971 guidance does address this specifically, but sort of more broadly, yes, a cybersecurity risk hazard, in terms of the failure of the design at some point is inherently a hazard in the device. Whether or not it's caused by, for example, some inherent flaw in the initial design of the device, or, for example, some new hazard that arises because somebody has created some sort of a cybersecurity hazard that did not exist before, it's still mandatory to incorporate that into your risk management documentation. So your risk management file is going to address cybersecurity in some way. The only question, and here's where we sort of slide over into the area between cybersecurity and quality assurance, is to what extent does the risk management file itself include all of the data within one, for example, if you're creating a risk assessment chart, for example, and to what extent does that chart refer back to separate documentation that was created possibly earlier on in the design process by the cybersecurity team, which is then useful to later on feed into the formal risk management activities that take place during design control. And so for that kind of early documentation of different kinds of cybersecurity hazards, I'm going to hand you over to Lauren.
We can't hear you, Lauren.
Respectfully on mute. Now I need to be respectfully off mute. So I don't really have a whole lot to add to what Dan just said there. I think he articulated it quite well. And really, I'm going to be that obnoxious security person when we talk about securities in everything that we do, literally everything that we do, physical security, technical security, administrative security, like security is just everywhere. And so I think it's important, to Dan's point, that it get added into your risk activities. Whether you combine them or keep them separate efforts, they still both have to exist.
We have another question around maintenance and software updates. So if we have a device with the capabilities to upload data to a cloud server through unidirectional communication and another device, the same intended use, but also has firmware update over air capabilities, how should we think about cybersecurity different for those two devices? So I think it's really around pushing updates.
I think you just kind of hit the nail on the head with that question, right? Like the difference is, one is unidirectional and the other one is that you can connect over the air, where it's bidirectional, right? So you're doing this give and take sort of relationship. So it's different by nature, and you have to approach it that way. And really when we talk about just pulling down updates, okay, so how are you ensuring integrity of that update? Are you doing any sort of integrity checks for those updates? And then when we talk about bidirectional, we're talking about, well, how are you securing that communication? Is there any way to intercept that traffic or man in the middle? Do you need to encrypt that data? What does that look like? So I think just recognizing that there is slight differences between unidirectional and bidirectional is really where you should spend your effort, and recognizing the different level of the controls that you may need to have. And obviously, David and you, John, if there's anything that you think is a value add, recognizing that this is kind of where you live as well from a software perspective, certainly adding context there. But I think that's the two big speaking points, is recognizing that there will be slightly different controls based on that communication.
I'll ask one more question from the audience, and then we can kind of end with a one question to go across everyone on the panel. So, Dan, can you explain what you mean by incorporating cybersecurity into things like complaint handling?
So the problem is now we have to figure out what FDA meant. And here I'm going to not be critical in any way. I'm simply going to point out that complaint handling as a process absolutely is subject to cybersecurity, concerns. I mean, if you think about it, anybody who has a fully, paper-based or even, internal document-based complaint handling system, even then, somebody could create some sort of situation where your users are having trouble reaching you because your input for complaints through emails or through your website or whatever has been compromised. So theoretically, complaint handling has to factor in cybersecurity. The problem is the guidance, now final, doesn't apply to all medical devices. And all medical devices have this concern. But if you make a hardware-only medical device, you do not have to apply cybersecurity currently to your complaint handling system. However, now, and by the way, anybody can stop me here, but if you have a device that's subject to the guidance, which is going to be pretty much every software device, and that's Lauren is discussing about how the FDA is defining that, then complaint handling is going to have cybersecurity considered into it. So how would you do that? You're not going to, in my opinion, incorporate it directly into your risk management system, because this is not a risk. This is not a hazard that's inherent to the design of the device, the manufacture of the device, or even the use of the device, correct? In other words, somebody could be hacking your complaint handling system with no device malfunction of any kind and device being used properly. So, for example, your complaint handling system could simply say that because of our awareness of the cybersecurity hazards inherent in, people being able to contact us through this system, that we provide them with two different channels that are publicly described or publicly explained. Or, for example, that with each channel that you can access us through, there is a description within that channel of an alternate channel. So, for example, if you're used to using only your website to have people submit complaints, you could, for example, have your website say, if you submit a complaint to us, right, or if you submit any communication to us and you don't get a response within 24 hours, please use this phone number, for example, right? So in other words, you're saying, and you can then say in your complaint handling system, I have now accounted for the possibility that somebody is somehow going to hack the website, so that somebody who believes that they're submitting a complaint isn't actually, right? So that's sort of one small example of how you could address it. Again, the whole question of why this doesn't apply to all devices, I'll leave that to somebody else to answer. Probably not within this forum.
So with 6 minutes left before our time is over, I'd like to ask one last question to the panel, and I appreciate everyone for throwing in their questions in the chat. Anything that we didn't get to today, we'll take offline, and when we distribute the slides, we'll follow up with some further answers. I do want to mention before we close that we have a survey that we'll send out to all the registered participants to get feedback on your thoughts of the webinar, just so that we can continuously improve and continue to add value to the ecosystem here. So when you receive that email, we would greatly appreciate you take the 5 minutes to fill out that survey. So to cap things off, team, I wanted to ask one last question. What is one of the most notable mistakes or blind spots you have seen with the variety of clients that you've worked with in your time, in your current roles, that really have a big impact on their ability to create sound software and cybersecurity documentation? So
I'll start.
Lauren will start.
Yeah, I can start. This is a very loaded question for me, because I think, generally speaking, security often is, we're looked at as this cost center. And so a lot of companies that come across my desk do not employ security professionals to help drive their security initiatives. And I think not recognizing the landscape and the changes and shifts that we're seeing from a threat perspective, I think really sets people behind. Like I said earlier, I can't tell you how many clients have said, well, that's not my job. I don't want to have to do security. Why should I have to do that? Or they're employing their, engineers or software developers to do their security work. And so I think it's important to recognize that you can teach anybody security, but I think it's important that you do have security professionals in your environment, whether that's internally or outsourcing it, to make sure that you are staying on top of this changing landscape. And I would say staying on top of it, trying to stay ahead of it as best as we can, because this landscape is shifting and we're seeing a lot of changes. And I think you're going to find that security professionals are going to be in pretty high demand now that FDA is shifting their guidance. So I think that's one of many answers I can give, but that's where I'll leave it here for this morning.
Great. You, John, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this question can't really be answered in the 3 minutes we have left, for sure. But I would say, I think, like, on a high level, think about all of this documentation that we're producing, we're talking about here, and think about how how to maximize usefulness to your particular organization, right? Like, for example, why should you capture your entire history of your design? Well, one philosophy is that, well, we need it to do all these FDA submissions, is one way to think about it. Or you can say, well, this will be great if we have new team members, we can tell them all the design history choices we made and not to repeat the same mistakes we made, right? So I think it's that change of mindset. It's like all this stuff should first and foremost be utilized to improve your entire organization, and then figure out how can we map this to what we need for FDA, for the EU. That's, I guess, in the time I have, like, that's kind of the top level mindset that I wish a lot of companies had going into it. That, hey, we're doing this to make it very useful for us, right? Like, documentation is not just an exercise. It's that, hey, we need to document this so that we don't forget it, right? So anyway, that's what I'll leave that conversation with.
I know we only have 2 more minutes, so maybe David, Dan, or Alex can add in last-minute comments.
Well, I think what I would kind of add in here is kind of backing up in history for me and kind of providing the viewpoint of an ex-FDA reviewer. In terms of the many different ways I've seen people try to kind of give explanations for why they don't need cybersecurity, I think most of us that on review staff have seen it all, as far as, basically saying that's not my responsibility, that's not something I have to do. And I think FDA has been very clear with their RTA rejection policy. And if you look at the size and scope of this new guidance that just came out, I think it's either 51 or 57 pages. They've spent a lot of thoughtful time on this. It's very likely, if you don't think cybersecurity is your responsibility, I think FDA is likely to disagree. So I'll leave it with that.
So value add, a shift in mindset. I love that. All right. Well, I promised that we would stay on time with maybe seconds left. Just want to thank you, everyone, for sticking around to the end. I know it flew by, but it was also long. So appreciate all your questions. Again, we're going to be sending out surveys. If you have any feedback for us on how to continue to put out helpful content, please let us know. Again, you will be getting the recording of this webinar as well as the slides. We will do our best to answer any outstanding questions from the chat or the Q&As. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.